Hello, and welcome to another episode of Talking All Things Cardiopulm. I am your host, Dr. Rachel Burriesci. Before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to highlight our sponsor, Jane. Jane is a complete practice management software that makes it easy to book, chart, bill, and get paid all online. The team at Jane knows that getting paid is one, if not the most important part of running your practice. With that in mind, they've created a fully integrated PCI-compliant payment solution called Jane Payments. That makes for a convenient online payment experience for you and your patients. With Jane Payments, you can collect credit card information through your online booking or intake forms, send one-click payment request emails or SMS texts for outstanding balances, and you'll never have to leave Jane to reconcile payments. Curious to learn more? Head to jane.app/payments. You can also use the code cardiopulm1MO at the time of sign up or a 1-month grace period on your new Jane account. A small gift from Jane to you. So thank you again, Jane, for sponsoring this podcast. So today I wanted to talk a bit about temperature and the heat. And as we all know and can see, most of the country, most of the world are seeing extraordinarily high record-breaking temps. And when this occurs, I think it's really important to spread knowledge of what we should be aware of as humans in this environment, specifically around exercise or activity. And I'm not here to stop anyone from exercising outdoors. I'm not here to say that you're not able to exercise in the heat, but I am here to give you base information about overall physiology and give you information so that you can make an informed decision. A few years ago, while I was teaching in faculty, I was on campus and I had a student who was an exercise science student, and she was very fit and she exercised daily. She lives and breathes movement. She promotes both strength training and aerobic training. She runs almost daily. And it was the heat of the summer. I think it was the hottest day of the year with extraordinarily high humidity. And she went out for a run. And when she came back to campus, she just wasn't feeling great. So she decided to take a shower. I later found out that she took a hot shower versus like a cold immersion shower. But obviously wasn't feeling right, was nauseous, kind of blurry vision, really just did not feel herself. She had the wherewithal to come across campus to my office. And as soon as she walked in the room, I noticed her color and was like, what happened? She was gray, her lips were pale, she just didn't look right. She was a bit disoriented. So within moments, I had her on the ground taking a blood pressure, checking her pulse, and actually calling for someone to call 911. And her pressure was low, her pulse was thready. She was mostly oriented ×3, but she was not herself, not able to answer simple questions quickly, very lethargic, and she started having chills and chatters. So she was able to say that she went for a run. When I had her on the ground after the person called 911, I had her get a cold cloth, put a cold cloth around her neck, temples, wrists, all the major points to help cool her down. But she wasn't improving. And then she was actually, like I said, had like a little bit of chatters, really lethargic. EMS eventually came and she ended up in the emergency room. Once they gave her IVs and she cooled down, she perked back up and was fine. But this was an active, fit, young athlete who was exercising like she normally does. It wasn't her first day exercising. She wasn't increasing her distance. She literally just did all of the things. She went out in the heat of the day while the sun was blazing in an extraordinarily high humidity. And she obviously wasn't able to compensate. And so that's the point, right? Can you acclimate to high temps and exercise in high temps? The simple answer is yes. But the long answer is it depends, right? It depends on you as the person. It depends on your age, your fitness level, your hydration level. What was your day like? What time of the day is it? What is the temp, the humidity? There are a number of factors that we have to consider when we are exercising outdoors. And so when we're thinking about mass population, the general public, I'm not really thinking about this young athlete who is relatively in great shape aerobically and still had this incident. I'm thinking about the general public. I'm thinking about the people with multiple comorbidities. And to be honest, I'm thinking about the young athlete who may be trying to push at the wrong time. So the simple answer is yes, you can adapt, you can acclimate, you can get to the point where you can exercise in high temps, but it all depends on the big picture, right? We have to look at the entire person, the environment, all of the external factors and internal factors that are playing a role in that very moment. So, just getting a little bit into physiology, okay? Typically, you've probably heard me say this before, but almost everything in our body runs on a gradient system, and temperature and thermoregulation does the same. We as humans run a very tight range, and statistically, we know normal temp as being 98.6 Fahrenheit, which translates to 37 degrees Celsius. But we never have a pinpoint number. Like everything in the body, there's always a range. And the range that is most common is 36.1 to 37.8 degrees Celsius, which translates to 97 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. And typically, we maintain core temperature within about 1 degree Celsius. And we have to also note that when our temp changes greater than 1 degree Celsius outside of that normal window of homeostasis, we're going to have biologic effect. One very simple physiologic process that occurs with change in temp is a shift in the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. When we have a fever, high temp, when we exercise, our body temp increases. We shift the curve to the right. When we shift the curve to the right, we actually unload oxygen more efficiently to get oxygen to the muscles that need it. Now, there are extremes to everything, right? So normally we're always doing this to some degree, but there can be the point where we shift too much and then have other problems that occur. So hypothalamus is the thermostat of the system. It basically helps send the signals required to adapt to the environment that we are in. And the human body is amazing. Its ability to adapt to multiple environments, the ability to be able to acclimate is phenomenal. But we can only do so much, and we have to understand that every adaptation results in a compensation, and can the body maintain it, right? This is where the whole person comes in. So the hypothalamus essentially is the main system that receives input from the sensory receptors in the body. And when it's very hot outside, when we get that response, that receptor feed, the hypothalamus is going to help regulate temp and help the body to dissipate heat. And that's the main job, right? So that we can maintain homeostasis and that we can maintain whatever we are doing. But we can do that to a degree. So the two main ways that the body will help compensate or adapt to the environment is to vasodilate at the cutaneous, at the skin, to help literally dissipate heat, like let heat out of the body. And we're going to increase sweat. So sweating is really the main way that we are capable of cooling our bodies in hot temperature. And as we are more fit, we have more efficiency, higher sweat level, with lower levels of activity, which allow the person to do more for longer. They're more efficient in heat dissipation. So when we sweat and it sits on our skin, that doesn't cool us. The cooling happens by creating that sweat into water vapor, which then gets pulled into the environment. And so now we have to think about the whole picture, the whole external environment, because we need the ability for evaporation to occur. So the process of evaporation actually allows for cooling and is the most effective way that the body is able to cool itself in high temps. And that's going to really depend on humidity. So there's two pieces of information that we need to consider when we are exercising outdoors: the temp, the humidity, and I'm even going to throw in wind. Those are really the three factors. Two primary is the actual temperature and the percent humidity. That all relates to what we know as the heat index. The higher the temp, the higher the humidity, the higher the risk. And I don't know where you are in this country at this moment or outside the country, because I know I have a couple of international listeners. But it's been hot. It's been very hot here. We have been sitting between 100 and 106 degrees Fahrenheit for about 2 weeks with some intermittent storms to help kind of break that heat. And I can't actually tell you the percent humidity, but it's been very high. As soon as you step outside, it feels like a convection oven. It feels thick, like the air feels thick, and sweating occurs almost instantly. Now, here's the issue. When we have high humidity, we have high water vapor in the air. So the percent humidity basically says how much percent water vapor exists in the air. So if we're at 70% humidity, the air is taken up by 70% water vapor. So it only has the ability to accept so much. So even though we sweat profusely when it's humid out, we are typically not cooling because evaporation cannot occur, because literally it cannot obtain more water vapor. So that's one part of the puzzle. The other is the actual temperature. So now I said before that our bodies run on gradients. We always move from high to low, okay? Typically, we as humans at 98.6 are hotter than the environment that we are in, okay? So if we were in a room, right, let's just say a standard room, no AC, or maybe there is AC, our body is going to emit heat. We're going to lose heat to the environment because we're hotter than the environment. That allows us to cool. As you add more people to the room, that temp in the room is going to increase because all of the humans are releasing their heat into that environment. So the cooler the temps, the more capable we are to eliminate heat. As, for instance, if it's 80 degrees out, right? If it's 80 degrees out, then us as 98.6 beings have gradient to move, which means we have the ability to release heat into the environment, which means we can last longer in whatever we're doing, even if that means at rest, right? Because just us being present in that space, we're going to emit heat. As we exercise, we're increasing our metabolic rate and increasing our core temp, period. So as we are 98.6 as just a general human body, and we exercise, our core temp is going to increase. When the temperature outside is something like 80 degrees, we have room to emit heat, to dissipate heat, to let off heat so that we don't overheat. When the temperature outside is in the 90s, we are going now from 98.6 to 90, we can still dissipate heat, but we have a much smaller gradient to do so. When that temp starts rising to 95, 98.6 to 95, we have an even smaller gradient, but we can still dissipate heat. What happens when the temp outside is greater than us is that we are now accepting heat. We're taking on that load. Radiation, we're absorbing said heat. So at 98.6, if it's 99 degrees outside, we're actually absorbing the heat from the outdoors. If it's 106 degrees outside, we're absorbing the heat from outdoors, okay? Heat radiates from warmer surfaces to colder surfaces, even in the absence of physical contact, meaning just being in the room, you are going to either lose or obtain heat based on the surrounding environment. Same is true if you were to touch something, right? If there was something cold and you touch that cold thing, your heat is going to warm up that surface and vice versa. So temp and humidity play a huge role in our ability to acclimate, accommodate, compensate to our external environment without any other factors being considered, right? Just our temperature compared to the temperature outside. So if we have 106 degree temps and we have high humidity, we have two external factors working against us in the world of, can I exercise safely outside? Well, you're going to be exercising, so your core temp is going to increase. And because you are outside and the temp is higher than your core temperature, you're going to absorb said heat. So now you're going to have this compounded increase in core temp. And your ability to cool down, dissipate heat, release heat is going to be compromised by the level of humidity, because if it's 70, 80% humidity, it can only absorb so much sweat. Now, two other factors that play a role in this are wind and sun. And so the fancy word for wind is convection. And wind or a breeze can actually help with dissipation of heat in the world of warm temperatures, because it's going to help pull those molecules away from the skin and allow you to cool down. The opposite is also true. When there is no wind and it's just standing still, which we've had a ton of that over the past few weeks, you almost start to have insulation of the air around your body, which then also contributes to this increase in core temp. And then the last piece that plays a role in all this is the sun, right? The sun on you, direct sun rays, is going to increase your core temperature. It's going to increase the radiant heat load. So all of those factors play a role in your ability to be outside at rest versus be outside with low level activity versus be outside and exercising at a percent heart rate or intensity. Okay. So these are the things I want you to consider. So some things that we can do to help include the types of clothes that we wear. Light colored clothing can help reflect the sun rays. So not wearing all black, especially you've seen I have a black hat. If I'm working outside and it's beating on my head, well, I'm literally just absorbing heat and maintaining it there. So something like a white colored hat or a light colored hat will help reflect those rays. The actual material can play a difference. The athletic material that you typically see, that wicking material, is the best thing that you can wear, because it helps wick the sweat off of your skin, which then allows for easier heat dissipation once it gets evaporated versus being absorbed in like a cotton shirt. Loose fitting clothing helps with that convection type thing, allowing wind to pull air away. Dark colored clothes absorb heat. It's going to increase that core temperature. Things like equipment. So think about our athletes. Football is one that comes to mind. Helmets absorb heat. Pads absorb heat. They're not going to allow for heat dissipation. So if you ever see football players with their shirt up, kind of exposing skin. That is actually a cooling technique to allow for convection to help dissipate said heat. Softball is the same, right? Think about the catcher, helmet, gear, knee pads, like you don't have any ability to release said heat. It's really, when I start thinking back and as I learn different things, it's really amazing that coaches and sports in general don't get a ton of information or education. Now, I do know things are changing and education is more readily available. There are more rules. There are prompted rest breaks and drink breaks that are very helpful. But typically, we're not educated on that. And I, myself included, I was a coach for many years before I was a physical therapist. And I was never educated on these things. And I was a player for many more years than I was a coach. And I will tell you, the conditions that we played in many times shouldn't have been allowed. I'm from New York originally. I played basketball and softball pretty much my entire life. And in New York, for both softball and basketball, we typically played on blacktop. So if we were outdoors, which most camps have at least some outdoor time, I remember going to one basketball camp that actually had primary courts were outside. So camps were typically in August in the heat of the summer on blacktop, and you are playing for 8 to 12 hours straight. Yes, there were water bins. Yes, there was the ability to buy a random Gatorade, but you weren't really encouraged to stop. You weren't really encouraged to take a rest break. And you're literally in the blazing heat. I think the only time we went inside was for lunch, and that was like a cooling time. So just like really interesting to think back that there wasn't more events, honestly. And we'll get into the differences between kids and adults, but kids have lesser ability to adapt to that type of climate. So the main adaptation, like I said before, is that we vasodilate at the skin, and that actually allows for heat loss. So pulling in the cardiovascular system and understanding what's happening here can also give us some understanding of what could go wrong, okay? If we are vasodilating at the cutaneous level, we are very cutaneous as a human species, and we are exercising, so we're vasodilating to the working muscles, we are going to have a decrease in preload, which is going to decrease our stroke volume. And if we remember, cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate. In order to continue exercising, maintain perfusion to your brain, we need adequate cardiac output. So the compensation to the adaptation is increase in heart rate. So just being outside, and I will attest to this because I do a lot of my work in the summer. I just sit outside because I enjoy being outdoors. But my heart rate will be higher just resting, being in that environment. Why? Because we have vasodilation occurring to help adapt and dissipate heat. And the compensation from the body or response from the body is, well, if we vasodilate, we're going to decrease preload. If we decrease preload, we decrease stroke volume, which is going to decrease our cardiac output. We can't let that happen. So what's the heart going to do? Speed up. So we have this increase in heart rate. Because we have an increase in heart rate, just standing still, you're going to have a more steep rise in heart rate with exercise. So in hot climates, you have a decrease in VO2 max because you're going to reach your max heart rate much more quickly. You fatigue much more quickly. Your body job is to maintain perfusion to the vital organs. And when we are exercising and trying to adapt to the heat, we have competing systems. So in order to maintain MAP, we actually end up getting vasoconstriction of the GI tract and kidneys. And you will hear people who exercise and get stomach pains, specifically in these types of environments, likely because they're not getting enough perfusion. So preload is the big cardiovascular adaptation that gets affected, and then the compensation to that is increased heart rate, which basically means you're not going to be able to last as long. From the pulmonary perspective, humidity tends to be the tipping point. And the reason is when it's very humid outside, we have to overcome that humidity to pull the air in. So it comes back to pressure gradients again. In order to inhale, normally, we have to create a negative pressure in our lungs greater than the atmosphere. And when we do that, we're able to suck air into our lungs. When it's high humidity, the environmental pressure is greater than normal, and our lungs will have to work harder to create that negative pressure and pull that air in. So it's a high to low. Very common for patients with COPD who have poor diaphragmatic excursion and interstitial lung disease to have greater issues with that high humidity type system. So cardiovascular and pulmonary are affected with high heat. So as you can see, when we add comorbidities to the list, the ability to adapt to exercise safely starts to have a tipping point. So the overall question that we said earlier is, do we have the ability to acclimate to hot climates? And the answer is yes. Typically, it takes a few days to up to 2 weeks in order to acclimate. But what does that mean? That means that for, let's say, 2 weeks, to be, a little bit more structured about this, for 2 weeks, you are increasing your exposure to the heat, getting used to physically being in the heat at rest, and then having repeated cycles of low intensity exercise to literally allow your body to adjust. And what will happen is your body will increase plasma volume, which is going to help decrease the overall problem with preload and stroke volume. So it's going to have a lesser strain on the heart when that happens. We will also end up increasing our sweat. So we become more efficient with sweating. It occurs earlier and at lower body temperatures. So we're cooling faster, and we just become more efficient with that heat dissipation, and we can sweat for longer periods of time. But it still remains true that it depends on your person and all of the other factors that play a role. So age is a big one. Both children and older adults have a harder time compensating and adapting to hot climate. So children have a higher core temp, especially infants, but children as well, and because they have a higher basal metabolic rate. They also have an increased basal metabolic rate and core temp to exercise in comparison to adults. So they just heat up more quickly. They also, although have the same number of sweat glands as adults, they are less efficient at actually producing sweat. So they don't have the ability to rely on evaporation for cooling. They have to rely on other things to cool down. So they can't rely on our main mechanism. They are at higher risk for heat injury, heat stroke, heat exhaustion. So it's super important for kids, especially at camp, that they have, rest breaks. They're in the shade. They're maybe not outside at 106 degrees running full court drills, right? Whatever the situation is at hand. Fitness level plays a huge role. So the better your fitness level, the more efficient you are at adapting. So endurance training alone can help lower your core temperature, can help early onset of sweating, can increase your total plasma volume, which will help with that adaptation with preload problem. and they have a smaller decrease in plasma volume during exercise. So they're maintaining preload better than the average person. There's also some research to suggest that people who perform HIIT training, even in neutral environments, will have a more efficient adaptation to hot climates. Hydration level, right? How we hydrate before, during, and after exercise can play a huge role in how we are able to compensate and adapt and acclimate to hot environments. We are considered dehydrated when we lose greater than 2% of our body weight. Now, our body weight is primarily made up of water volume. So if we're losing greater than 2%, you're going to see a cardiovascular effect. You're going to see possible strain. You're going to see impaired performance and likely signs and symptoms. The big piece, or the most obvious piece with dehydration, is that we have a lower plasma volume. Lower overall total fluid is going to result in a decrease in preload. Same as what happens with vasodilation, but now it's a compounded effect. So if we have vasodilation trying to help us dissipate heat, causing a decreased preload, and we're dehydrated, causing a decreased preload, we're going to have decreased stroke volume, decreased cardiac output, and our heart rate increase likely won't be enough to compensate. So ACSM recommends that you weigh yourself pre and post activity for a more accurate understanding of how much loss you're having with exercise, because people vary on how much they sweat, how fast they start sweating, and we even sweat and have heat dissipation even when we're not physically feeling it. So we lose a lot of volume throughout the day with normal evaporation. So super important that we are hydrating before, during, and after. The recommendation during exercise is actually frequent small bouts of drinking versus large boluses. So they recommend 200 to 400 milliliters of fluid every 15 to 20 minutes. So every 20 minutes is actually a good cue for coaches to give water breaks. I can't say that we for sure ever had that. I think it was like hours, like every 2 hours, maybe there was a scheduled water break. Things have changed. People have been better educated, but I do worry about our young athletes and just coaches in general, maybe not having the education to properly lead a group of players for safety reasons. Water is technically preferred over sports drinks, because it actually allows for better gastric emptying. But a benefit to the sports drinks can be glucose, and the glucose has multiple benefits, but one of which includes better intestinal absorption. So there's some mixed research on that. From an electrolyte perspective, sodium is actually super important. So having electrolyte type replacement drinks, LMNT, or some people say Element, is the electrolyte replacement mix that I like to use, and something I wish I had access to when I was dealing with POTS. But sodium is super important to basically prevent dilution of your volume. And if we are solely drinking water versus sodium electrolyte mix, then we're going to have increased diuresis of our water. We're going to be more diluted, and we can actually have a delay in rehydrating. So super important that if we are profusely sweating, that we are replacing electrolytes as well. Body composition also plays a big role. So if we have a greater amount of adipose tissue, that can have maladaptation type problems to it for two main reasons. One, it can increase insulation, so actually prevent heat dissipation. And the other is that it increases metabolic cost, which typically with activity, which typically also increases core temperature greater. And then the last piece, before we get into like heat exertion, is comorbidities, right? So everything we were talking about up until this point is really just the average person, healthy average person. Once we start throwing comorbidities into the picture, exercising outdoors in the heat becomes much more problematic and a higher risk overall. So, for instance, patient with heart failure. Patient with heart failure has a decreased ejection fraction, decreased cardiac output at base. When we exercise, they're going to compensate. If we throw heat into the mix on that and they have a decreased preload and an increase in heart rate, they're going to fatigue quicker, potentially have more detrimental symptoms. Patients on beta blockers. This is a big one, right? Because this is a blunting medication, meaning we're going to blunt heart rate response when we take a beta blocker to help all of the other things, right? Like heart failure, we decrease contraction and we decrease heart rate and we're decreasing blood pressure. It's wonderful to help maintain that problem. But now if we are exercising in the heat and we are vasodilating and we have this decreased preload, the compensation is to increase heart rate to maintain cardiac output. If you're on a beta blocker, that's not going to happen. So that person needs to be educated, especially because they can deteriorate pretty quickly. Like I mentioned before, patients with lung disease need to be aware of heat index and air quality because that's going to put increased strain on the lungs and could lead to shortness of breath, which typically leads to an increase in heart rate. And now we have another compounded effect. So not going to last as long. It is super important that if you're working with this patient population, or if you're listening to this podcast and you have family members, to educate them on this. If you're going to exercise in the early morning or late evening when the temps have cooled. Why? Because it's going to allow for that thermal gradient. We're able to dissipate heat much more effectively. If we have high heat indexes, it is not the time to exercise outdoors, especially if we have high comorbidities. And then we should be encouraging our patients, our clients, to either exercise in their house, at a gym. And if they don't have access to either of those things, I highly recommend walking at a big box store. Home Depot, Lowe's, Costco, Walmart, any place that is large enough where they can actually get into a walking pace around the edges. And I give the same advice for people who have to take their dogs for a walk. We have a very high energy pup, and if I don't get out early enough, then we can't get our walk in. She very much needs that exercise. In those events, we go to Home Depot or Lowe's and just walk the store. It gives both of us the opportunity to get our steps in, but we can do it safely. Clothing matters. Lightweight, loose fitting, light colored. You should be good to go. Hydrating, pre, during, post. Small amounts during, make sure we're replacing sodium and other electrolytes post. Got one more big one, safety concern. Have a cell phone on your person. Have a cell phone on your person in the event that you can't go any further and that you're not pushing to get home quicker and then we tip over that threshold. Apple Watches, I want to put a plug in here. I've had actually a number of patients. I think I'm going to do a wearable podcast soon. Apple Watch heart rate on research has pretty good accuracy. But the thing I've been really encouraging patients, like in the hospital setting, is if they have access to an Apple Watch is to wear it because it has fall detection. I've had at least 10 patients at this point have a fall, whether it was traumatic or from like they just couldn't go any further, have a fall, Apple Watch goes off, EMS will call the watch. And if you don't answer, they send help. And I've had a number of patients make it to the hospital safely because of that. So just a plug-in for Apple Watch is not an affiliate or anything. It's just, I'm seeing this quite a bit. I've had patients with seizures. I've had patients with traumatic falls. I have a patient who was on a dirt bike in the middle of nowhere. I had a farmer with high heart rate. Maybe he even had an MI in the middle of the farm, like far from visual view, went down, fall was detected, and EMS got to him. If he didn't have that on, he wouldn't have been found for hours, maybe even the next day. So something to consider, but always have an ability to communicate when you're going out. And I highly encourage patients with heart disease, even in not hot temps, or lung disease, if they're going out for a walk, if they're going to a park, if they're going somewhere by themselves, to have a means to communicate out if something was to go wrong. The last piece I wanted to quickly talk about was signs and symptoms that we should be aware of that can indicate heat exertion. So non-specific symptoms of heat exertion include thirst, hyperventilation, tachycardia, weakness, fatigue, cramping. Cramping is usually a high sign of poor electrolyte imbalance, headache, poor concentration, impaired judgment, anxiety, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, syncope. Again, back in the day, I feel like such an old person. Back in the day when I was an athlete, and I've had coaches boast about pushing players to puking. That's not a good goal. At that point, you're over the tipping point and you shouldn't return back to sport that day. We all know what has happened if you were a player or a coach. If a person is experiencing 90% of those symptoms, thirst might be the only one that I would be like, make sure you're hydrating. But as soon as if you're thirsty, you're already on the verge of dehydration. Everything else, pretty much a back off or stop. Okay. We start to tip over that heat exertion to heat exhaustion when we start to get more symptomatic and our core temperature increases. The other piece of it is we're no longer compensating. We can no longer maintain cardiac output, which is what results in worsening symptoms. So typically body temp is somewhere between 101.3, which translates to 38.5 degrees Celsius, to 104 degrees, which is greater than 40 degrees Celsius. Core temp. Okay, so heat exhaustion, we have an increase in core temp between 101 and 104 degrees. The person might experience rapid weak pulse, fatigue, weakness, profuse sweating, psychological disorientation, and fainting. This was my student who walked into my office. The only thing that didn't happen was she didn't technically syncope, and I think it's only because she made it to my office before she did. But it was inevitable for that being the next step. This is caused by acute fluid loss and the inability of your cardiovascular system to compensate for the demands of the body and the heat compounded together. What do you do if your person is demonstrating these symptoms? Move them to a cool place. Give them fluids, encourage them to lie down. In severe cases, they might need IV for rehydration. This is also the person that you might want to put cold cloths on neck, temples, armpits, groin, wrist. Basically any place with a good pulse, okay? The next possibility is heat injury, which can lead to organ damage and rhabdomyolysis. So as you can see, if we don't address the symptom, it's going to progress and get worse. So hopefully you have something to say, stop. You have a symptom that you see that you can stop it before it progresses. The last bit is heat stroke, and heat stroke is a medical emergency. It's actually the third leading cause of death in high school athletes. That stat is a few years old, but I would be curious to see if it's still that number. It can be life-threatening. It can cause severe central nervous system dysfunction. This is the person who is now progressing over those symptoms, and we're moving into organ failure. It can result in severe muscle and liver cell death, cardiovascular collapse, seizures, elevated temp up into 104.9 and greater, tachycardia, vomiting, diarrhea, hallucinations, and coma. What to do if your person has tipped over this threshold? Well, number one, call 911. Number two, cold body immersion is the best way to help cool the body the fastest. So the recommendation is cool water immersion up to the neck at 35 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, so like a cold basin. And you want to get their temperature down to about 102 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's when you pull the person out of the immersion so that you don't cool them down too quickly. If you don't have access to a tank, neck, armpits, groin, wrist, cold cloths, constantly wetting them, or ice packs to bring down the core temp. That has showed to have the best results to prevent death. Now, the key here is to not get to that point. And how do you not get to that point? Is by being educated. And what should we be doing at this point? We should be taking rest breaks, staying out of direct sunlight, making sure we're getting water breaks every 20 minutes or so. Assessing for symptoms, not pushing people through symptoms. I think this is a really important topic. I think as these temps continue to increase throughout summertime, it's important for us to be aware and also to understand that this is a huge safety concern. Even if you are a healthy, young individual, you can only compensate so much. Can you compensate? Can you adapt? Can you acclimate? Yes, but it takes time and structure and gradual increase to do so. Not just, hey, I want to get back into running today. I'm going to go out for a run for the first time. It's 106 degrees at 80% humidity. I will be fine, right? So the whole picture matters. One piece of the story is never the whole story. And I think that's an important piece to kind of take away from this. So to recap, in the heat, our body helps to release heat by vasodilating at the skin and by sweating. The more aerobically conditioned we are, the more efficient we tend to be at heat dissipation. When we are vasodilating and sweating, we have to understand that we're having a decrease in volume, therefore a decrease in preload, which is going to decrease our stroke volume, which could lead to a decrease in cardiac output. The compensation is increase in heart rate. Because your heart rate increases, you're going to have a lesser tolerance to exercise, whether that's intensity or minutes or whatever. You're not going to be able to last as long, go as far, or at a higher intensity because we have decreased VO2 in these types of temps. When you add direct sunlight, humidity, lack of wind, that is going to compound the effects of the heat. In cardiac rehab and pulmonary rehab, we encourage our patients that 80-85 degrees is max temp that they should be exercising outside. Because at those temps, they can still move their temperature across that thermal gradient. Once we're into the 90s and above, we are no longer able to dissipate our heat. We are then absorbing, which means our core temp is going to increase higher. If we have high humidity, we have decreased ability of sweat to actually evaporate and cool us down. So lots of factors to consider. How do you combat all that? Early morning training, late at night training if you want to be outdoors. Otherwise, switch to indoors in a climate-controlled environment. If you don't have access to a gym, use a big box store. Clothing, light in color, loose fitting, wicking material. Stick to the shade if you are outside so that you're not absorbing direct sunlight. Always carry a phone or some sort of device to call out for emergency if anything goes awry. And please, please, please hydrate pre, during, and post exercise to set us up for success. And if your person is starting to demonstrate symptoms, that is a stop. Okay, stop, hydrate, rest, cool down, likely not return to exercise. Okay, I hope this was helpful for you. If it was, or you have a coach in your life, or you have kids and sporting events, share this podcast, get the message out. We don't need to add increased risk to something that can be really beneficial and wonderful, right? We don't need to add the risk and safety and potential hospital admission just from poor decisions. So all of these things can be used with your patients, your clients, your family. Educate, educate, educate. If you have any questions for me, please reach out on Instagram, on the DMs, or on text at 913-308-4494. I hope you all have a wonderful day and stay cool out there. And of course, get after it.